The autumn wind whistled through the empty streets of Deadwood, carrying the bitter scent of coal smoke and broken dreams. Sheriff Henry Anderson stood at his office window, watching the first rays of dawn paint the Black Hills in shades of amber and gold. His trembling hand reached for the silver flask in his vest pocket, a morning ritual he'd come to hate but couldn't seem to break. The discovery of gold in these hills had transformed this quiet territory into a powder keg of greed and desperation. Behind him, Deputy Charlie Moore cleared his throat softly. "Another report from the Miller Creek mines, Sheriff. 3 more claims jumped last night. The prospectors are saying it was Confederate uniforms this time." Henry's shoulders tensed as he tucked away the flask, untouched for now. His brother Frank's face flashed through his mind, the same face he'd seen through iron bars 5 years ago after that bloody night at the Taylor family ranch. The town of Deadwood had grown too fast, like a weed choking out everything good and decent. What had started as a simple mining camp was now a maze of hastily built structures, muddy streets, and too many saloons. Henry had watched it all from behind his badge, trying to maintain order while fighting his own demons. The gold in these hills had brought out the worst in everyone, himself included. Margaret Clark, the owner of the Paradise Hotel, was already sweeping her front porch when Henry stepped into the street. She paused her work to give him a knowing look. She'd been the one to find him passed out behind her establishment more times than he cared to remember. "Heard about your brother, Henry," she said softly. "Word is he's gathering men up near Cheyenne. Confederate deserters mostly, the ones who never accepted surrender." The mention of Cheyenne made Henry's chest tighten. He'd arrested Frank there after tracking him for weeks through the territory. The murder of Robert Taylor and his wife Susan had shocked even the hardened souls of the frontier. Frank had always claimed the gold deposit under their ranch was rightfully his by discovery, but the Taylors had the legal claim. The blood of that night still haunted Henry's dreams. Daniel Walker, the telegraph operator, came running down the street, waving a yellow paper. "Sheriff! Message from the marshal in El Paso." Henry took the telegram, his eyes scanning the coded warning. Frank Anderson had been spotted leading a group of 30 men north, all heavily armed. They'd raided 2 towns already, taking not just gold, but establishing their own twisted form of government in each place. Rachel Moore, Charlie's wife and the town's schoolteacher, watched from the schoolhouse steps as Henry gathered his deputies. She'd lost her brother in the war, fighting for the Union, and the sight of Confederate uniforms still made her blood run cold. The children whispered about ghost riders in gray, coming to claim the gold in the town for a cause that should have died at Appomattox. The saloon doors of the Lucky Strike burst open, spilling out the night's last patrons into the growing light. Laura Anderson, Henry's wife, emerged from their small house behind the jail, her face etched with worry. She'd stood by him through the drinking, through the night terrors that came after he'd locked up his own brother. Now she saw the same haunted look in his eyes that he'd worn 5 years ago. Martha Walker, the town's only doctor, had already opened her clinic expecting trouble. She'd seen enough gold fever to know its symptoms, the madness that made men forget their humanity. When Henry stopped by for his usual headache powders, she noticed his hands weren't shaking for the first time in months. Fear, she realized, was proving stronger than whiskey. The morning stage brought news from miners fleeing the northern camps. Frank's army had grown, incorporating claim jumpers and deserters into a force that moved like a plague across the territory. They called themselves the New Confederacy, but their true religion was gold. Henry knew his brother's real mission wasn't about lost causes or precious metals. It was about settling an old score written in family blood. Henry stood at his office window, watching dust devils dance down the empty main street of Deadwood. Most folks had shuttered their businesses, leaving only the saloon and Martha's clinic operating in defiance of the growing tension. His badge felt heavier than usual today, its tarnished surface a reminder of promises made and broken over the years. The telegram from Cheyenne, warning of Frank's approach, lay crumpled on his desk, next to an untouched bottle of whiskey. The sound of horses drew his attention to the north end of town. Charlie, his youngest deputy, came riding hard with Robert close behind. They'd been scouting the old mining trails, keeping watch for Frank's advance party. The cloud of dust trailing their horses spoke of urgency, and Henry's hand instinctively moved to his revolver as he stepped onto the boardwalk. "They've taken the Henderson place," Charlie reported, breathless as he dismounted. "About 20 men, well armed." Frank's not with them yet, but they're flying that damned new Confederacy flag. Robert nodded grimly, adding that they'd seen fresh tracks heading toward the abandoned Silver Creek mine. Henry knew that maze of tunnels well. He and Frank had played there as boys, before the gold strike turned their childhood refuge into a battleground. Inside the office, Henry spread out a worn map across his desk. The Henderson farm controlled the main road into town from the north, while the Silver Creek mine offered hidden access from the east. Frank was planning to box them in, using the tactical skills he'd learned during the war. Henry's hands hovered over the map, trembling slightly. Not from withdrawal this time, but from the weight of memory. Rachel, the schoolteacher, appeared in the doorway with Laura, who ran the telegraph office. They brought news that riders were buying up supplies in El Paso, men matching the description of Frank's Confederates. The circle was tightening, and Henry felt the familiar urge to reach for the bottle. Instead, he gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white, focusing on Martha's words from that morning about fear being stronger than whiskey. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window as Henry outlined his plan to the small group gathered in his office. Susan from the general store had joined them, bringing reports of unusual purchases: dynamite, fuses, mining equipment. Frank wasn't just coming for revenge. He was planning to take the whole territory, starting with the rich veins of gold still hidden in the hills around Deadwood. "We can't wait for help from Dodge City," Henry declared, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. "Frank knows every hour gives me time to build defenses. He'll come soon, probably at night." The others nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. This wasn't just about two brothers anymore. It was about protecting their homes, their futures, their very way of life. As twilight approached, Henry organized the townspeople into watches. Daniel, the blacksmith, began fortifying the bank and storefronts. Margaret supervised the movement of women and children into the stone church, its thick walls offering the best protection if shooting started. Through it all, Henry felt his brother's presence growing stronger, like a storm building in the distance. The night brought an eerie calm to Deadwood's streets. Henry walked his rounds, checking on the volunteers posted at strategic points throughout the town. The moon cast silver light on the weathered buildings, reminding him of another night 5 years ago when he'd faced his brother across the barrel of a gun. He'd chosen the law then, but the cost of that decision had haunted every bottle he'd emptied since. Near midnight, Martha joined him on his rounds, her medical bag ready for whatever was coming. She didn't speak of his sobriety or offer congratulations. She simply walked beside him, a steady presence in the growing darkness. Together they watched the distant flicker of campfires in the hills, counting the lights, estimating the size of Frank's force. Tomorrow would bring blood to Deadwood streets, but tonight belonged to the quiet before the storm. As dawn crept over Deadwood's eastern hills, Henry watched the first rays of sunlight catch the frost on the weathered boardwalks. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gnawing absence of whiskey that had been his constant companion for half a decade. Martha had left an hour ago to prepare her clinic for what was coming, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of his badge. Through his spyglass, he could make out movement in Frank's camp. His brother had always been methodical, even in his crimes, and Henry knew he'd choose his moment carefully. The Confederate deserters who'd joined Frank's cause were different from the usual bandits. They were trained soldiers who'd traded one lost cause for another, making them all the more dangerous. A rider approached from the direction of Cheyenne, kicking up dust along the trail. Henry recognized Charlie, one of his deputies who'd been scouting the territory. The young man's face was drawn with exhaustion as he dismounted, his spurs ringing hollow on the wooden walkway. "Sheriff, they've got at least 50 men up there. Some are breaking off toward the mining camps north of town." Henry nodded grimly. Frank was splitting his forces, trying to draw the town's defenders thin. The gold shipment stored in Deadwood's bank vault would be his primary target, but his brother had always enjoyed creating chaos. The mining camps, with their scattered clusters of prospectors and their hard-earned gold, would make tempting secondary targets. Inside the sheriff's office, Robert and Daniel, his most trusted deputies, were checking their weapons and ammunition. The wall map showed the key points they'd have to defend: the bank, the assay office, and the 3 main roads into town. Henry traced the routes with his finger, remembering how he'd taught Frank these same tactical considerations when they'd both worn badges in El Paso before the war changed everything. Sheriff Henry Anderson leaned against the dusty wall of his office in Deadwood, his trembling hands betraying the familiar craving for whiskey. The discovery of gold in the nearby Black Hills had transformed the once quiet settlement into a chaotic boomtown, drawing prospectors and opportunists like vultures to carrion. But it wasn't the usual rabble that troubled him today. Word had reached him that his brother Frank was leading a band of Confederate deserters through the territory, leaving a trail of emptied banks and burned settlements in their wake. The morning sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows as Margaret Clark, the town schoolteacher, strode purposefully into his office. Her face was etched with concern as she placed a telegram on his desk. "Your brother's men robbed the bank in Cheyenne yesterday," she said softly, knowing the weight these words carried. Henry and Margaret had grown close over the past year, she being one of the few who knew the full story of how he'd arrested Frank for murdering a family of settlers 5 years ago. Outside, the constant clatter of stamp mills crushing ore provided a grinding backdrop to the town's nervous energy. Gold fever had gripped Deadwood like a disease, with new claims being staked daily in the surrounding hills. Daniel Moore, the assayer whose office stood across the street, had been working around the clock evaluating ore samples. The influx of wealth had made the town a tempting target, and Henry knew his brother would be drawn to it like a moth to flame. Robert Taylor, Henry's deputy, burst through the door with news that made the sheriff's blood run cold. A group of riders had been spotted heading toward town from the south, led by a man matching Frank Anderson's description. They'd already raided 2 mining camps, not just taking gold, but forcing the miners to swear allegiance to what Frank was calling the new Confederate territory, a lawless domain he intended to carve out of the Dakota Territory. Susan Walker, owner of the town's largest saloon, had become Henry's unlikely ally in his struggle against drinking. She'd helped him stay sober for 3 months now, understanding his need to have his wits about him. As she brought him coffee that afternoon, she shared whispered conversations she'd overheard. Frank's men had sympathizers in town, including Charlie Moore, Daniel's brother, who'd been quietly stockpiling weapons in his barn. The town council gathered in secret that evening, meeting in the back room of Martha Taylor's boarding house. Henry laid out his concerns, but the wealthy mine owners were more worried about protecting their investments than the larger threat. Rachel Anderson, Henry's cousin who ran the town's only newspaper, argued passionately for bringing in federal troops, but everyone knew help would arrive too late if Frank struck first. As dusk settled over the town, Henry stood at his office window, watching miners trudge back from their claims. The gold they carried would soon fill the bank's vault, making Deadwood an irresistible prize. His hands shook worse than usual as he thought of facing his brother again. The last time, in a courtroom in El Paso, Frank had sworn he'd return to destroy everything Henry held dear. Now that promise loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Laura Moore, Daniel's wife, and the town's doctor had treated enough gunshot wounds to know the coming violence would overwhelm her small clinic. She worked with Margaret to convert the schoolhouse into an emergency hospital, while Susan Walker's girls sewed bandages from donated sheets. The women's quiet efficiency stood in stark contrast to the mounting tension among the menfolk, many of whom were choosing sides even before the first shot was fired. The discovery of a rich new gold seam in the northern hills sent the town into a frenzy of activity, drawing more miners away from the relative safety of Deadwood streets. Henry knew Frank would use this chaos to his advantage. Through his network of informants, he learned that his brother's force had grown to over 50 men, many of them hardened veterans of Quantrill's raiders who'd never accepted the war's end. They weren't just coming for gold. They wanted to establish their own kingdom where Confederate laws still held sway. As night fell, Henry sat in his office, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. The bottle of whiskey in his desk drawer called to him with its siren song, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. Through the window, he could see Charlie Moore's barn, where loyal deputies kept watch on the suspected cache of weapons. Tomorrow would bring either his redemption or his downfall, and he needed to face it with a clear head and steady hands. A sharp rap at the door startled Henry from his contemplation. Daniel, his youngest deputy, burst in with news that made the sheriff's blood run cold. 3 riders had been spotted approaching from the north, carrying a white flag of truce. Through his spyglass, Daniel had recognized one as Robert, Frank's second-in-command during their days together in the Confederate cavalry. The message was clear. Frank wanted to parley. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Deadwood's muddy main street as Henry stepped onto his office porch, His hands trembled slightly, but not from the familiar whiskey shakes. This was raw anticipation, the kind that came before a storm broke. He'd seen that same weather-change tension in the townspeople's faces as they hurried to shutter their businesses and clear the streets. Margaret, the widow who ran the general store, caught his eye as she ushered her young daughter inside. She'd lost her husband to Frank's gang during their last raid on the stage line to Cheyenne. Her gaze held both fear and fierce determination, a look Henry had grown accustomed to seeing in the mirror. The town had suffered enough under the shadow of his brother's malice. The riders approached slowly, dust clouds billowing behind their horses like ghostly shrouds. Robert's scarred face was instantly recognizable, his Confederate colonel's coat still worn with defiant pride despite its tattered condition. The other two men were strangers, but their hard eyes and well-maintained weapons spoke of experienced killers. "Sheriff," Robert called out, reining his horse to a stop just beyond pistol range. "Frank sends his regards and an offer. Give us free passage through Deadwood, a share of the new gold coming down from the hills, and we'll leave your precious town standing. Fight us, and we'll burn everything to the ground." His voice carried the soft Louisiana drawl that had once charmed many a Southern belle before the war turned him cruel. Henry stepped forward, conscious of Daniel and Charlie positioned on the roof of the mercantile, their rifles trained on the visitors. The weight of his badge felt heavier than usual as he considered his response. "Tell my brother that Deadwood's already seen enough fire and death. If he wants to talk terms, he can come himself instead of sending his errand boys." Robert's face darkened at the insult, but he maintained his composure. "Frank figured you'd say something like that. That's why he sent this along." He tossed a sealed envelope that landed in the dirt at Henry's feet. "You've got until sunrise tomorrow to decide. After that, we'll show you what real war looks like." As the riders wheeled their mounts and galloped away, Henry retrieved the envelope. Inside was a faded daguerreotype of two young boys standing proudly beside their father's general store in El Paso before the war had torn their family apart. On the back, Frank had scrawled a simple message. "Some bonds can't be broken by bars or badges, brother." Laura, the saloon owner who'd helped Henry through his worst bouts with the bottle, appeared at his side. Her usual sharp wit was replaced by genuine concern. "Whatever's in that letter, Henry, don't let it cloud your judgment. Frank knows exactly where to stick the knife to hurt you most." The sheriff tucked the photograph into his vest pocket, feeling its weight like a stone against his heart. "He always did know my weaknesses, Laura, but he forgot that facing them made me stronger." He turned to address the gathering crowd of townspeople. "Anyone who wants to leave before tomorrow should go now. Those who stay need to be ready for a fight." As the sun set behind the hills, Henry organized the town's defenses. Charlie and his sons transformed the livery stable into a makeshift armory, while Susan and Rachel from the boarding house coordinated the evacuation of women and children to the old mine tunnels. The familiar urge for whiskey gnawed at him, but for the first time in years, Henry found strength in its absence rather than its embrace. Night settled over Deadwood like a funeral shroud, bringing with it the cold clarity of impossible choices. Henry stood at his office window watching the distant flicker of campfires in the hills, Frank's army preparing for tomorrow's reckoning. The photograph felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of promises made and broken, of the fine line between justice and vengeance that he'd walked since pinning on the badge. A sharp knock at the door interrupted Henry's brooding. Daniel, the young deputy he'd hired last spring, entered with a worried expression that made him look even greener than his 23 years. "Sheriff, riders coming in from the east. But they ain't Frank's men. It's Marshal Robert from Cheyenne, with about 15 Federals." The news sent a complex wave of emotion through Henry. Relief mingled with shame at needing outside help to handle his own brother. The Marshal's arrival brought both hope and complications. Robert had been Henry's mentor years ago in Dodge City, before the war and the drinking had changed everything. Now his presence was a reminder of better days, when the line between right and wrong had seemed clearer. The two men clasped hands in the lamplight, Robert's weathered face revealing nothing of whatever judgment he might hold for his former protege. "Heard you had trouble brewing," Robert said simply. "Thought you could use some badges who still remember what side they fought for." His eyes flicked to the empty whiskey bottle on Henry's desk, but he said nothing about it. Sheriff Henry Anderson stared at his reflection in the saloon window, his hand trembling as he lifted the glass of whiskey. Behind him, The bustling streets of Deadwood churned with gold-crazed prospectors and opportunists. His brother Frank's words from their last confrontation still haunted him. "When I return, this whole territory will burn." 3 years had passed since Frank escaped the prison wagon, gathering Confederate deserters and outlaws to his cause. Now, word had reached town that Frank's army was amassing in the hills, preparing to strike. Margaret Clark, the town doctor's widow, who'd been helping Henry stay sober these past months, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than the bottle, Henry. Your brother wants you weak when he comes." She took the untouched whiskey from his trembling fingers, pouring it onto the dusty floorboards. The saloon fell silent as the amber liquid spread like blood across the wood. The door burst open as Deputy Charlie Moore stumbled in, clutching his bleeding arm. "Sheriff, they've hit the Anderson mine. Your brother's men. They're holding the workers hostage. They're demanding you come alone." Henry's heart sank. The Anderson mine had been in their family for generations, before the gold strike that turned brother against brother. Now Frank was using it to draw him out. Daniel Taylor, the mine foreman, had managed to escape during the raid. His face was covered in coal dust and blood as he described the scene. "They've got dynamite rigged throughout the tunnels, Sheriff. Frank says if anyone but you approaches, he'll collapse the whole operation with 30 men still inside. But there's something else. I saw Confederate military wagons. They're moving in heavy equipment." The pieces clicked into place in Henry's mind. The Anderson mine didn't just contain gold, it connected to a vast network of underground passages that stretched across the territorial border. Frank wasn't just planning revenge, he was establishing a base for something larger. With control of the mines, his army could move unseen through 3 territories, emerging to strike and vanish like ghosts. Susan Moore, Charlie's wife who ran the telegraph office, brought more disturbing news. Messages from El Paso and Cheyenne, similar raids happening all along the border. Former Confederate officers coordinating with Frank's men. They're calling it the New Confederation, planning to carve out their own lawless territory using the old mine networks. Henry's hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in months, his mind was crystal clear without the whiskey's fog. "Margaret, get word to the territorial marshal in Dodge City. Charlie, round up every deputy and able man you can find. Robert Walker at the bank has a private militia. Tell him it's time to earn his gold. We move at sunset." But Frank had anticipated his brother's response. As the defenders gathered in the town square, a massive explosion rocked the earth. The Anderson mine's main shaft erupted in flames, sending a pillar of fire into the darkening sky. Through the chaos, riders emerged from every side street. Frank's men had already infiltrated Deadwood, hiding among the prospectors and drifters. In the ensuing firefight, Henry spotted Frank atop his white stallion, wearing their father's old cavalry sword. Their eyes met across the mayhem, and Frank's voice carried over the gunfire. "The gold was never enough, brother. This is about building something new. No more corrupt marshals or territorial laws. Join me or die with your precious badge." Rachel Taylor, Daniel's daughter who'd grown up alongside the Anderson brothers, appeared at Henry's side with a rifle. "Your brother died in that prison wagon, Henry. The man out there is someone else now." She was right. The Frank he knew would never sacrifice innocent miners for power. As thunder rolled across the hills and lightning illuminated the burning town, Henry made his choice. The time for redemption was over. One Anderson brother would not survive this night. The first shots rang out as lightning split the sky, illuminating the mud-slicked streets of Deadwood in stark flashes. Henry dove behind an overturned wagon, his hands steady despite months of tremors from the bottle. The familiar burn of whiskey called to him, but for the first time in years, his mind was clear. Through the gun smoke, he watched Frank's men methodically surrounding the town's defenders, using the confusion of the storm to their advantage. Rachel crouched beside him, her dress soaked through with rain and spattered with mud. She'd grown from the pigtailed girl who used to fish with the Anderson brothers into a woman hardened by frontier life. "Daniel and the others are holding the mining office," she whispered, feeding shells into her rifle. "But Frank's men have dynamite. They'll blow the whole building if they have to." Thunder rolled across the Black Hills as Henry assessed their options. The Confederate deserters were well-trained, unlike the usual bandits who plagued the territory. They moved with military precision, covering each other as they advanced through the streets. Among them, Henry recognized Charlie, Frank's former cellmate who'd helped orchestrate the prison break. The man's scarred face twisted into a cruel smile as he directed men to take up positions around the square. Memory flashed through Henry's mind. The day he'd arrested Frank for killing that claim jumper. His brother had sworn it was self-defense, and maybe it was. But the territorial judge had been pushing for examples to be made, and Henry had chosen his badge over blood. Now, watching Frank coordinate the assault on Deadwood, he wondered if prison had simply finished what their father's cruelty had started. Martha, the aging proprietor of the Golden Nugget Saloon, appeared at a second-story window with a shotgun. Her first blast caught one of Frank's men in the chest, sending him sprawling into the mud. But the return fire was devastating, forcing her to duck back as bullets splintered the wooden facade. Henry heard her cry out and knew they were running out of time. "We need to reach the mining office," Henry told Rachel, checking his ammunition. "Frank wants the claim records. Without them, he can't prove who owns what. That's how he'll control the territory." He didn't add that the office safe also held over $20,000 in gold dust waiting for transport to Cheyenne. Some things were better left unsaid, even to trusted friends. The rain intensified, turning the street into a river of mud and blood. Through sheets of water, Henry spotted Robert, the young deputy he'd hired last spring, trying to organize a defense near the livery. The boy had potential. But tonight that wouldn't matter. As Henry watched, a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet found its mark, and Robert collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Something broke inside Henry then. Not the sharp pain of loss, but the final shattering of whatever bond had stayed his hand against his brother. He checked his revolvers one last time, feeling the weight of every decision that had led them here. "Rachel, get to Daniel. Tell him to hold the office no matter what. I'm going to end this." Frank's voice carried over the storm again, mocking, "Still hiding, little brother? Some things never change." The words stung with childhood memories. Frank always the protector, until their father's rage and the bottle had poisoned everything. Henry stood, mud dripping from his duster, and stepped into the open street. Lightning flashed again, reflecting off his star as he walked toward his brother's position. Behind him, Rachel's voice cracked with emotion. "Henry, don't!" But there was no other way. The time for words had passed with the first innocent blood spilled. As Henry advanced through the firefight, he saw Frank dismount, tossing aside their father's sword. This would end as it began. Two brothers, guns, and the weight of choices that could never be undone. The storm raged around them as they faced each other in the churning mud of Deadwood's main street. Frank's men held their fire, sensing the moment's gravity. Even the thunder seemed to pause, as if the Black Hills themselves were holding their breath. Henry's hands hovered near his guns, remembering every quick-draw lesson Frank had taught him when they were boys. But this time there would be no brotherly guidance, no pulled punches, only lead, lightning, and the final judgment of whatever God watched over such forsaken places. Frank drew first, his movement fluid as quicksilver in the storm-cast darkness. Henry felt the familiar burn of whiskey in his throat begging for attention. But for the first time in years, his hands were steady as oak. The crack of gunfire split the air between thunderclaps, and Henry felt the hot slash of a bullet grazing his shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. His own shot found its mark in Frank's gun hand, sending his brother's revolver spinning into the mud. Behind the false front of the assayer's office, Rachel worked frantically with Martha and Laura to move the townspeople through the back alleys toward the mine tunnels. The Confederate deserters had already set fire to the livery stable, and orange flames licked at the rain-soaked sky, casting demonic shadows across the battlefield that Deadwood's main street had become. "You never could shoot worth a damn when it mattered," Frank snarled, cradling his bleeding hand. He kicked his fallen gun aside and drew a second pistol with his left. "Remember Dodge City? You couldn't pull the trigger then either. Had to wait till I was sleeping to take me in." Lightning illuminated the hatred etched into his features, so similar to their father's in his final days. Henry felt the old shame rise up, but pushed it down. "You killed those miners in cold blood, Frank. Their gold claims weren't yours to take." He kept his gun trained on his brother's chest, even as memories of their childhood flooded back. Frank teaching him to ride, to shoot, to survive in this merciless territory. "I did what the law required. The storm's fury intensified, and through the deluge, Henry caught glimpses of movement as Frank's men began to encircle them. Charlie, Frank's lieutenant since their prison break, was positioning sharpshooters on the rooftops. Sheriff Henry Anderson stood atop Boot Hill in Deadwood, watching the sun rise blood-red over the distant hills. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his father's silver pocket watch. 36 hours now without a drink, the longest he'd gone in years. The town below was eerily quiet, most citizens having fled after yesterday's brutal shootout that left 3 of Frank's men dead in the muddy street. Only the most stubborn holdouts remained, along with those too poor or too proud to run. Margaret Taylor, the schoolteacher who'd stuck by Henry through his darkest days, approached quietly from behind. She carried his old deputy's badge, the one he'd given up drinking over after that terrible night 5 years ago, when Frank first went bad. "The gold shipment arrives at noon," she said softly. Robert Clark spotted Frank's gang camped in Devil's Canyon. At least 30 men now. Henry nodded grimly, his weathered face etched with pain both physical and emotional. The betrayal still cut deep, his own brother Frank leading Confederate deserters on a rampage across the territory, all because Henry had done his duty and arrested him for murdering that claim jumper in '69. The fact that Frank had escaped prison and come back with an army still felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Inside the shuttered bank, Daniel Moore finished loading the last of the strongboxes. The weekly shipment from the Northern Belle mine was the richest yet, over $50,000 in raw gold. Frank's intelligence network had to know about it. Susan Moore, Daniel's wife, helped him seal the vault while their young son Charlie kept watch at the window, clutching his father's spare revolver. The town's remaining defenders had transformed Main Street into a fortress of sorts. Rachel Walker, the saloon owner who'd cut Henry off from whiskey 2 days ago, had her girls helping pile sandbags around the hotel. Martha Clark and Laura Anderson distributed ammunition and bandages to the volunteers, mostly miners and shopkeepers who'd never fired a shot in anger, but were ready to defend their homes. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of the gold wagon, racing in from the Northern Belle under heavy guard. Henry watched it approach through his spyglass, noting with growing dread the second, larger cloud of dust following behind. Frank's army was making their move. The sheriff's hands shook harder as he lowered the glass, but this time it wasn't from withdrawal. It was fear for what was coming. The first shots rang out just as the wagon reached the edge of town. Frank's cavalry burst from the tree line in 3 coordinated groups, firing as they charged. Henry's volunteers returned fire from their barricaded positions, but their aim was poor. The sheriff himself stood in the middle of the street, calling out orders and trying to maintain some semblance of control over the chaos. Margaret's voice cut through the gunfire. "Henry!" The south wall. He spun to see Frank himself leading a 4th group of raiders who'd somehow circled behind them. They were using dynamite to breach the bank's rear entrance. If they reached the vault, all would be lost. Not just the gold, but any hope of maintaining law in the territory. This was Frank's real aim, to prove that civilization itself was a lie. What happened next would be debated in Deadwood for years to come. Some said Henry Anderson finally snapped, reverting to the legendary gunfighter he'd been before the badge and bottle claimed him. Others insisted he acted with careful calculation, but all agreed on the essential facts. The sheriff charged the bank alone, firing with deadly precision as he ran. 6 of Frank's men fell before they knew what hit them. Inside the bank, Henry found Frank holding Daniel Moore's family hostage. "Drop it, brother," Frank sneered, "or watch them die like that claim jumper." But Henry saw something his brother didn't. Charlie Moore had worked his way behind Frank with his father's gun. The boy's hands were steady as he aimed, showing more courage than men 3 times his age. "No more killing," Henry said quietly. "It ends here." The shot that followed wasn't from Charlie's gun, but from Margaret Taylor's rifle through the window. Frank stumbled, his gun hand suddenly useless. Before he could recover, Henry was on him. The brothers grappled briefly before Henry's fist connected, laying Frank out cold. Outside, seeing their leader captured, the remaining raiders lost heart and fled, pursued by the emboldened townspeople. In the aftermath, as prisoners were rounded up and the dead buried, Henry Anderson did something that shocked everyone. He poured himself a drink, but instead of downing it, he handed it to his brother, who sat handcuffed and bleeding. "You'll need this where you're going," Henry said. "Prison's hard sober." Frank stared at him with something like respect before accepting the gesture. It would be their last moment as brothers. Margaret found Henry later at their father's grave, finally allowing himself to grieve. "The territory marshal's office offered me a job," he said, without looking up. "Cleaning up the borderlands, building something lasting. But I'd need a partner who understands both justice and mercy." She took his hand, and together they watched the sun set on old Deadwood, where a new kind of law had taken root in blood-soaked soil. The Northern Belle's gold shipments continued under heavy guard, but Frank Anderson's raid marked the end of an era. The border territories slowly yielded to civilization, though hints of wildness remained. Charlie Moore grew up to be a lawman like Henry, who never touched another drop. And if anyone asked about that last drink he'd shared with his brother, Henry would just smile and say, "Sometimes mercy was the hardest justice of all." Years passed, and the border territories transformed under Henry and Margaret's watchful guidance. Their partnership, both in law enforcement and life, became legendary from Deadwood to El Paso. They established a network of deputies and lawmen who shared their vision of justice tempered with understanding, turning previously lawless stretches into places where honest folk could build lives without fear. Charlie Moore grew into his badge with a wisdom beyond his years, having witnessed both the darkness and redemption possible in men's souls. He never forgot the day Henry had saved him from Frank's gang, and carried those lessons into his own work patrolling the expanding railroad lines that stitched the territory together like steel sutures, healing an old wound. The Northern Belle mine eventually played out, but not before bringing enough prosperity to transform Deadwood from a rough camp into a proper town. Susan, who'd lost her husband in Frank's raid, used her share of the mine's profits to build a school, ensuring the next generation would have opportunities beyond gold fever and gunsmoke. Her daughter Rachel became its first teacher, helping to civilize the very streets where her father had died. Henry sometimes found himself drawn to his father's grave during difficult cases, no longer seeking absolution but perspective. The old man had been right about one thing. A lawman's true strength lay not in his gun hand but in his judgment. Margaret would often join him there, understanding his need to reconcile the past with their present work of building something better from the ashes of brotherly betrayal. Daniel, the former Confederate soldier who'd survived Frank's last stand, served 5 years before earning early release through Henry's testimony about his surrender and assistance. He settled in Cheyenne, using his engineering skills to help survey new railroad routes, finding redemption in connecting communities rather than dividing them. Every Christmas, he sent Henry a letter, each one a reminder that change was possible. The legend of the Anderson brothers became a cautionary tale told in saloons from Dodge City to the Mexican border. But those who knew the truth understood it wasn't simply a story of good versus evil, but of choices and their consequences, of mercy's power to break cycles of violence, and of the thin line between justice and vengeance that every lawman had to walk. Martha, the widow who'd tended Henry through his worst days of drinking, lived to see her prediction come true. The territory did indeed need men who understood both sides of human nature. Before she passed, she witnessed Henry swear in a new generation of peace officers, including her own grandson. Each one taught that the badge meant protecting people's better angels from their worst demons. Laura, who'd lost her brother Robert in the war and nearly lost her faith in humanity during Frank's reign of terror, found purpose running a halfway house in Deadwood for those seeking to leave their outlaw past behind. She and Margaret often worked together, believing that preventing crime through compassion was as important as punishing it through force. The border territories never completely lost their wildness. That was part of their nature and appeal. But under the guidance of those who'd learned from the Anderson brothers' tragedy, they became places where law and order grew naturally from the community rather than being imposed by force alone. The old-timers said you could still hear ghost riders on moonlit nights, but their hoofbeats grew fainter with each passing year. Henry never spoke of Frank's final moments to anyone but Margaret, keeping that last shared drink between brothers as both a wound and a reminder. He'd learned that some debts could never be paid, some bonds never broken, and some choices would haunt a man forever. But he'd also learned that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant building something better from the lessons of the past. As the century drew to a close, Henry and Margaret's legacy lived on in the new towns sprouting along the railroad lines, in the schools where children learned more than just reading and shooting, and in the next generation of lawmen who understood that true justice required both strength and wisdom. The border territories had changed, but their story remained. a testament to the power of choosing mercy when vengeance would have been easier.